Good morning. Thank you so much to coming to the CUNY Urban Food Policies Forum on What Role for SNAP? Lessons from the Pandemic. We chose this topic because there have been so many changes in SNAP in the almost 2 years now that we have been facing this pandemic. And we thought it was an appropriate time to take a step back to understand what lessons we've learned, both about what does work and what doesn't work in this time of crisis to address the dramatic increases in food insecurity and hunger that the pandemic and its economic consequences brought about. We have three very informed and wonderful panelists. I will introduce them and we're going to then have a discussion. I'm Nick Freudenberg. I teach public health at the CUNY School of Public Health, and I'm also a senior faculty fellow at our Urban Food Policy Institute. Our first speaker will be Samir Siddiqui, who is an associate policy researcher at the RAND Corporation based in Washington, D.C. Our next speaker is Sergio Matas Cisneros, who's a domestic policy analyst at Bread for the World, also in Washington, D.C. And they'll be followed by Jan Poppendieck, who is a senior faculty fellow at the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute and a professor emerita of sociology at Hunter College. And to get us started, I'm going to ask Samir to tell us a little bit about the SNAP's benefit cliff. What is it, and what adjustments in eligibility and administration are needed to minimize SNAP recipients from falling off this cliff? Samir?
I'm a tremendous fan of Jan and Nick's scholarship and work, and so delighted to participate. So to the question, I will assume that folks attending have some familiarity and perhaps more expertise in working and understanding the benefit cliff. But basically, the benefit cliff is when an individual loses public benefits on account of increased income, which results in a net loss in terms of the overall amount of money folks are taking home. So for SNAP, benefits cut off at a gross income of about 130% of the federal poverty level. That's currently about $28,000 annually for a family of three. So to give folks a sense of kind of what this looks like, based on 2019 data, for example, say there's a single parent with two children making roughly $12.50 an hour, and they're receiving 160 or so per month in SNAP benefits. A small 50% raise that they might get would put them over that 130% income cutoff. And so they'd end up losing their entire $160 monthly SNAP benefit while only gaining roughly $80 in additional wages through their raise. And so that's a net loss for that family. And so that reality is present for many that rely on SNAP. And it's particularly problematic because, if you lose benefits, whether they're housing, medical care, childcare, SNAP, food is an area where individuals might make sacrifices. They might buy cheaper food, go without meals, whereas they have less flexibility to do that for things like housing or childcare. And then, because each public benefit program has its own cutoff and requirements, some will have their own asset tests, which will limit or cut off benefits if you have, more than a certain amount in savings or, property worth a certain amount. It makes it really confusing. You're never quite sure when you might lose benefits for any particular program. And that's particularly difficult when we're talking about programs like childcare or housing for which there are waiting lists. And so losing, SNAP is bad, but losing a program that you've been in line for a year or more is particularly consequential. And so kind of what happens in practice with SNAP and other public benefit programs is one of a few scenarios. So indeed, many will lose benefits. That might happen kind of without them anticipating it. It might happen suddenly. There's another scenario in which individuals will kind of live in fear of losing benefits and avoid any changes to their income. And so they might avoid taking raises, they might avoid kind of improved work or training opportunities. And then there's other scenarios in which individuals might slowly accumulate more income through raises and then lose benefits and slowly increase their income. And
can you, are there, to your knowledge, legislative proposals to remedy this problem?
Yeah, sure. So the most straightforward approach that states rely on is simply raising that 130% income limit and removing asset tests. And so broad-based categorical eligibility, which is a state, which is an option states can exercise within SNAP, will do exactly that. It'll raise the income cutoff, and that in many states will, including New York, effectively mitigate the problem that the benefit cliff poses for SNAP. There are other options as well. So some states and local jurisdictions are investing in financial coaching, benefit calculators, kind of benefit transition navigators, so almost like patient navigators, to help folks that are enrolled in these programs kind of better understand whether they might actually face that benefit cliff, how they can potentially manage it. There are as well some more innovative approaches. Some local jurisdictions actually fund supplemental benefits, and so kind of accepting that families are going to lose benefits, and so they make additional contributions to offset those losses. There's also state earned income tax credits, which can smooth out the effects of the benefit cliff, and that's particularly helpful if it's administered monthly or quarterly, as we're seeing now with the federal child tax credit.
Can I ask another question? And I apologize for interrupting. We have a lot a lot of changes in the works. I wanted to switch and talk a little bit about online ordering via SNAP. There's a lot of interest in that. My colleague Nevin Cohn has been looking at some of the experiments with that. Could you explain to our participants what is online ordering via SNAP, and any suggestions for making it a more effective program for helping people to reduce food insecurity?
Yeah, sure. So it is as it sounds. The Farm Bill allows SNAP in some pilot programs to be used online for delivery of groceries. So kind of same limitations on what you can purchase, but you can do it online. And so kind of started off slowly. New York was one of the first jurisdictions to enter the pilot. On account of the pandemic, it rapidly expanded. So by August of last year, 46 states and DC are participating in the pilot, more since then. And around then as well, about 4% of SNAP households were participating in online SNAP redemption. And so it's a small share, but it's increasing rapidly. Right now, what we're seeing is it's limited to large retailers, Aldi, Walmart, Amazon, Fresh Direct. And that's partially on account of the review process that the Food and Nutrition Service has to ensure the retailers that are participating are set up to do so in the best way. And this program really, I think, has immense potential to be of use. These are households relying on SNAP that have limited access to a private vehicle, have limited physical access to a store, have schedules that kind of preclude them from shopping for food. And so the qualitative research that I've seen suggests that there's interest among beneficiaries, particularly for the convenience and ability to save time. But there are concerns about the cost. Delivery fees, for example, aren't covered by SNAP, and so folks have to kind of pay for those in other ways. There's concern about the ability to select high quality food. If you're not picking it yourself, can you rely on someone else to do that for you? Is online shopping more expensive? There's concerns about that, as well as kind of general mistrust. And so to address these challenges, I think there's a lot that could be done to mitigate some of those barriers. So for example, covering delivery fees or setting up kind of delivery hubs that can help blunt the cost of delivery fees. Folks can, pick it up somewhere convenient that's not necessarily the grocery store. And then also the Food Nutrition Service really needs to accelerate the review process to ensure that the stores that communities rely on currently are able to participate, not just the kind of, larger Walmarts, Amazons of the world. And so I think we'll see it continue to become more common. In the study that we're doing in Pittsburgh, predominantly older Black Americans experiencing poverty, we're seeing up to 20% relying on online grocery delivery. And so I think we'll see this become more common. And so ensuring that some of those barriers are mitigated, I think, is how we can accelerate that uptake.
Thank you. And I have one more question for you before moving on to Sergio. There's a program called SNAP Ed, which provides education for SNAP recipients. Could you tell our participants a little bit about SNAP Ed and any thoughts about strengthening it, and particularly using SNAP Ed to inform policy and systems interventions?
Yes, happy to. SNAP Ed is kind of this underutilized program. It often takes the form of SNAP agencies and states and counties conducting nutrition education or marketing, but the program actually allows for work that's focused on policy systems and environments. And so it's not just kind of laws, ordinances, regulations, rules related to nutrition, but it can take the form of kind of institutional or organizational interventions. And so there's been this kind of growing movement amongst folks that work in and around SNAP Ed to better utilize these multi-level policy and system-oriented interventions. And so the program, explicitly encourages them and allows funds to be used for them, but there's still a lot of, there's kind of lack of clarity on the part of implementing agencies, folks on the ground, and on what exactly it looks like. And so there's been some efforts to kind of lift up evidence-based policy and system interventions. And the kinds of things I'm talking about here are, for example, programs that improve the food environment within schools, or cafeterias within workplaces, or there's one program out of Baltimore, for example, that works with local retailers to ensure that they're stocking healthier food, particularly if they're accepting SNAP benefits. And so those are the kinds of policy and institutional interventions that can really complement the nutrition education that SNAP agencies are most comfortable administering. And it really enhances the benefit of SNAP. It enhances the benefit of other kind of nutrition education activities. And it meaningfully, I think, improves the food environment in which folks are using SNAP benefits. And so I think to improve that uptake, there needs to be more education and coordinating across SNAP agencies. There's some that are doing a really good job administering these programs. And so more kind of information sharing and exchange and training will go a long way. And then also there are these evidence-based approaches that are being studied, and those should continue to be lifted up so that SNAP agencies are aware of them and are able to use them. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, an underutilized, but potentially a transformative complement to SNAP.
Thank you so much. Before turning to Sergio, I wanted to mention that we're putting some resources, some written by the panelists, some by others, about SNAP. Check the chat. We'll also put them on the website later, and we'll also show them on the screen at the end. Sergio, the first question I wanted to ask you is, one of the problems with SNAP is that there have been a large group of people experiencing food insecurity and hunger who have not been covered by SNAP for a variety of reasons, including their documentation status. I wonder if you could tell us about what you think state and local governments could do to bring food benefits to food insecure people who are now excluded from SNAP, and also what you think the federal government could do to address the needs of that population. Are you with us, Sergio? Make sure you unmute yourself and show yourself.
Yeah, it says that it says disabled host disabled video. So, but I can stop. I can talk. Thank you so much for having me, Nick. To be part of this. Oh, okay, there we go. There
Right.
I am. Sorry about that. Yeah. So we're still through a pandemic, and there's been some groups that have been excluded from accessing SNAP benefits, who probably have needed it during this health crisis. So I quickly want to talk a little bit about what the federal government can do, and then what some states and local governments have been doing. So, throughout the years, Congress has, put some bans on who can access SNAP. And, one of them has been, in 1996, when, Congress, was a big welfare reform. One of the things that they did was they excluded some people, and they put lifetime bans on individuals who, were convicted of drug felonies, were not able to receive SNAP or TANF. And, one study found that, 90% of individuals who return back into society, experience food insecurity. So one of the things that, and this is kind of like, so Congress said states can opt into this. So a lot of states have decided to opt in and put this lifetime ban. So one of the things, and there's legislation in Congress that would remove this, which is called the Mail Act. And then there's also, it's also kind of a 5-year ban for people who are lawfully present here. And there's also legislation in Congress that would address this. So people who are here lawfully present, who are permanent residents or are DACA recipients, kind of have to wait 5 years in order to access these important benefits. And Lift the Bar Act would actually remove this 5-year kind of waiting period in order to access, this critical program. And so, these are immediate steps that the federal government can do for people to, access these benefits. However, in many states, some states have decided to give, people who are here lawfully present, access to SNAP or other similar programs by using their state funds or state-run programs as well. And then I, also just quickly want to, talk about, there's also this fear of, public charge has always, has been around for quite a while in immigrant communities, especially the last administration we saw some harmful rules from the last previous administration, which prevented a lot of people who, were food insecurity, but the fear of becoming a public charge, they did not access SNAP benefits, even though they qualified. And just because of this fear, for example, I grew up in an immigrant family, and this is something that was always a big fear. People didn't want to access public benefits because when it's time for them to apply to be lawfully present in the country, they didn't want to seem like they were a burden so they would not access these benefits, even though they had U.S. citizen children who benefit from these programs. So even though the public charge rule is no longer in place, and the administration is right now in the process of reviewing and implementing some new stuff, information has not been disseminated, and people are still fear of accessing programs like SNAP. especially during a critical period of we've seen food insecurity rise at levels that we've never seen. We haven't seen in a long time.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask you about something else. Also during the pandemic, but before as well, many jurisdictions, including New York City, have experimented with online enrollment and re-enrollment for SNAP. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about some of the ideas that have emerged during the pandemic for expediting online enrollment and eliminating some of the burdensome application requirements.
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the things that we knew at the beginning of the pandemic is, we didn't know how long the pandemic was going to last. We know a lot of people were losing work, and children were, were going to lose their meals at schools because schools were closing and people were losing their jobs. So we knew that there was going to be an uptick of people applying to SNAP. And one of the first things that we did, we're an advocacy organization. So, one of the things that we urge Congress to do immediately at the beginning of the pandemic is to adjust some of the administrative requirements and operations in order to get as many people SNAP benefits as possible. And, before the pandemic, it's 37 million people were in SNAP. And by May of 2020, that number had risen to 43 million. So in order to quickly, add 6 million people to SNAP benefits, you have to make some, big administrative adjustments and requirements, and waive some waivers. So Congress gave states the ability to, extend certification periods and adjust the reporting requirements. So, we saw states also waive interview requirements, and as well as, accept applications also over the phone, because not everyone has access to the internet or has access to a computer to be able to apply, and use periodic procedures instead of more intensive recertification process. And this is one of the things that we have really been advocating for. And I think the pandemic has helped us do this, is we have a really rigorous process of how people have to report for SNAP. And usually, people don't have sometimes the time to go through all these processes of recertification in order to continue the program. So then they fall off the program, and then now they're experiencing food insecurity. So one of the things that we've learned through the pandemic is that we can make recertification process super easy, flexible for families that don't have to necessarily go in. Sometimes they're working a day job and they're not able, because mostly, in order for these certification periods, it's usually during the business day. So people cannot take just time off and go do these things, or they might experience childcare or other different barriers that might come up. And simplifying recertification and enrollment increases and it gets the help, reaches the people that it needs to reach. So I think that's one of the biggest lessons that we need to take out of the pandemic. And a lot of these waivers are extended until this month. We don't know if a lot of them are going to continue. A lot of them are set to expire this month. So that means we might see a huge cliff of people fall off, because we're going to go back into those rigorous certification requirements we had pre-pandemic.
And depending on the trajectory of the pandemic and the economy, that could be particularly devastating to have another wave of people out of work and being food insecure. I wanted to ask you another question. Could you tell us a little bit about the Close the Meal Gap Act and how it might affect SNAP?
Yes, definitely. So Closing the Mail Gav Act is a piece of legislation that was introduced earlier this year in both the House and the Senate. I believe Senator Gillibrand from New York is one of the lead co-sponsors. It's a piece of legislation that Bread for the World has endorsed. But before, in August later, the administration increased SNAP benefits. But what this would do is I would actually increase the baseline of SNAP benefits by approximately 30% from pre-pandemic levels, and it would also eliminate a lot of the barriers that I was talking about when it comes to like eliminating the time limits on benefits, or eliminating the gap on people to be able to apply for it. And then another thing that sometimes it's left out, but it would also extend benefits to territories, ending the discrimination those who live in the U.S. territories, because usually the same things don't apply due to the states in DC. Usually the territories have to go through a different process, or funding comes through that. So it would kind of just eliminate those and just create a path of transition them into just the traditional SNAP program.
Great, thanks. And one last question. Can you explain the recent changes in budgeting for the Thrifty food plan, and whether you think additional changes are needed?
Yeah, so many of you know that major reforms to SNAP how Congress deals with it is every 5 years, Congress passes the Farm Bill, which is this major piece of legislation, and SNAP is in there. So in the last Farm Bill, which was in 2018, Congress, it was a bipartisan piece of legislation. Congress mandated the United States USDA to review the Thrifty food plan, so the benefits that people are receiving on SNAP, and they had to do it by 2022, so by next year. When the Biden administration came in, they expedited that, so they were not going to wait until next year to review the Thrifty food plan. They said, let's do it. Because in the American Rescue Plan, we knew that they had gotten a 15% increase to SNAP, and it was going to end in September. So they were going to use this administrative mechanism to review the plan. And also in the piece of legislation, it says that now on, every 5 years, USDA has to review it. So from now on, the USDA has to, review, the way they're calculating SNAP benefits. So this was something that was agreed upon by Congress in 2018 in the bipartisan Farm Bill.
Great. Thank you so much for all that information. And one of our aspirations for this forum is that all of us who do food policy and food policy advocacy would understand better the range of proposals that are on the table, so that we can make informed decisions about where to go next. I'm now going to turn to my colleague, Jan Popendiek. Jan, nice to be together again with you. And I've noticed that senior faculty fellows often get asked to provide the historical perspective. So that's where I'm going to start. Taking the long view of SNAP reforms over time, what have we learned that may guide us in thinking about SNAP for the next period?
Okay, well, I have indeed been a SNAP watcher, or a food stamp watcher, for half a century. And so I took this opportunity to think back over that whole history of growth, cutbacks, fightbacks, changes in access and benefit levels in SNAP, to think about what might guide us moving forward. And so I've got, 6 simple statements here. The first is that advocacy works. In part, advocacy works because these programs, and we're focusing on SNAP, but SNAP is only one of now 17 federal food assistance programs administered by the Department of Agriculture. These programs are complicated. If you were listening to what Sergio was saying about recertification and the process, it's very easy to get into the weeds. Legislators do not have the time to become real experts on all of these programs. And that's where the advocates come in, because the advocates do spend day and night learning about how these programs are actually functioning on the ground, listening to clients and frustrated would-be clients, applicants, and distilling this information to feed it into the legislative process. The best example of this in some ways is not actually in SNAP, but in school food with the community eligibility option that was created. It's a kind of stealth legislation. Everybody were focusing on the nutrition standards in the child nutrition reauthorization, and somebody snuck in someone really familiar with how it works on the ground, the community eligibility option. So I just want to say advocacy works. It makes a huge difference. We have enormous records of success, both in legislating improvements and in defending existing benefits from would-be cutbacks. The second thing I've learned as I've looked back over this is that persistence pays. Don't give up. The time will come. Advocates began promoting elimination of the purchase requirement in food stamps. Many people now don't know that once you had to buy your food stamps, you paid 30% of your income for your food stamps, and then you received food stamps that were supposedly adequate to buy a adequate diet for your household size. So of course that cut out many people who could not get together the money to purchase their food stamps. So it was a priority of food stamp advocates from the very beginning, but it took an entire decade before it became law. So the same thing could be said about reevaluating the Thrifty food plan. We've been asking for that for decades, and we finally got it in the 2018 Farm Bill. And that leads me to my third generalization, which is that politics matters. It mattered a lot that after Congress authorized the revision of the Thrifty food plan, that people who cared about access to benefits and benefit adequacy were in the Department of Agriculture and ready to undertake that reauthorization once or recalculation once the Biden administration came in. Sometimes I think of the whole advocacy enterprise as a kind of training ground or shadow cabinet situation. The people who are running programs in USDA, food assistance programs in USDA today, many of them have come from years of working from the outside as advocates. So see advocacy partly as a training ground for future decision makers. The next thing I would say as I look back over this is that details matter. People glaze over when you get into the weeds on these programs, but I'm going to give you two examples. One is the history of quality control sanctions on states for error rates. During the 80s and 90s, well, the Reagan administration, when it came in, introduced sanctions for states, charging them a financial penalty if their error rates in food stamps exceeded the national average. And this caused states to take all sorts of steps to try to reduce their error rates by defensive actions, excessive verification of requirements of documentation, all things that deterred people from accessing benefits to which they were legally entitled. And after welfare reform, the situation reached a kind of crisis point because the whole process of verifying people for food stamps, as it was still called then, changed because it had been that anyone who was receiving aid to families with dependent children was automatically eligible for food stamps. When they canceled AFDC and replaced it with TANF, there was enormous confusion. And one of the results was that the participation by households with a working member, working families, dropped dramatically because states were taking actions to prevent having to deal with those families because the error rates were so high and they didn't want to pay the financial penalties. And when the Clinton administration started its food stamp initiative, it changed the error rate regulations greatly simplified the situation and changed the threshold for the error rate from $5 to $25. So it wiped out a great number of the state's errors with a stroke of the pen. And I give that example because it dramatically changed access to food stamps for working families and for other families. And that's the point at which participation, which had plummeted after welfare reform, began to rise toward the very robust program that we now have. So someone mentioned 43 million families now. At the height of the Great Recession, it was 46 million persons, not families, participating in SNAP. So when I say details matter, somebody has to be watching what's actually happening on the ground. And so that leads me, well, one additional detail I want to mention is that food stamp allotments used to be recalculated every 6 months. And I don't remember in what year they switched it to yearly. But if you are calculating the benefits, meaning you're costing out the Thrifty food plan, a market basket that reflects the Thrifty food plan, in only once a year, then there are periods when it's been 18 months since the benefit was calculated. And in any period of rapid food price inflation, this means that the benefit is far less than it would be if we calculated it more often. So again, people have to pay attention to the details. And so that leads me to my fifth pronouncement, which is that research matters. And I guess I say that on behalf of the academics who've worked in this area. But research on what's actually happening to people on the ground has made a huge difference. Among other things, it provides arguments that advocates can then use to convince legislators to make changes. And I think recently, all of the longitudinal studies of the impact of participation in SNAP, particularly people whose families participated when they were children, showing outcomes better, more educational attainment, better health, and better lifetime income, are convincing. It turns out that $1 spent on SNAP benefits is a very good investment for American society. So research matters. And finally, devolution matters. As SNAP has evolved, more discretion and power has devolved to the hands of the states, to state and local decision makers. And this has created options for states to enthusiastically or aggressively pursue access to SNAP for citizens of the state. And many governors and mayors have figured out that this is a way to bring federal dollars into their jurisdictions. So devolution matters. And I think that's my summary of what I've learned looking back over 50 years of the SNAP history.
So helpful, Jan, thanks. We're going to move to the poll soon, but I want to give you two more questions for maybe your quick responses, and maybe we can discuss them a little bit. The first one is an issue that you and I have been caring about passionately for a long time, and that is college students and SNAP. And I wonder if you could say something about what you think the federal government could do to facilitate enrollment of college students. And I'll give you both questions. The second one is, what do you think should be the rules around work requirements in SNAP? So if you could briefly comment on those two questions, and then we'll turn to the poll.
Okay, so I think it's time to end the college student exclusion. The way the law is written now, it says that students enrolled full-time students, which is actually anybody enrolled half-time or more, are ineligible for SNAP unless, and then there's a series of exemptions. And then there are a lot of exemptions to the exclusion, but it's time to end the exclusion. It was created based on a myth in the first place, the myth that there were lots of affluent students setting up households and claiming SNAP, students who were really financially dependent on wealthy parents. So that would be my first choice. would be to get rid of the college student. It's archaic, it's obsolete. It doesn't make sense now, given the very much changed nature of the college student body in the United States. Okay, so so that's a quick answer. And the quick answer to work requirements is, I think it's time to end work requirements in SNAP. And I think the pandemic, one of my hoped for silver linings in the pandemic is that it may have raised consciousness about the fragility of work in our society. I think of Maggie Dickinson's work, which raised my consciousness about the amount of work that people do that doesn't count as the 20 hours a week that able-bodied adults without dependents have to do to qualify for SNAP. In order for your work to count toward qualifying for SNAP, it has to be a registered employer on the book, taking Social Security payments. So all of the work that people do in the informal economy doesn't count. So I think it's time to end that. We know that our society functions better when people can eat and when they can move toward a healthier diet. And we need to find other ways to nurture, support, and encourage work.
Thank you so much, Jan. I'm going to put up some of the references that we've been showing, and in case you're interested, and as I said, we'll put those. And we're now going to move in the final part of the session into asking your opinions in two different ways. First, we're going to, in just a moment, put a poll up on the screen and ask you to answer it. The poll has two parts. We're going to present 10 ideas, some of which we've talked about today, for making changes in SNAP. And we're asking you first to rate these 10 ideas one by one on their importance, to indicate whether you think it's highly important, medium importance, low importance, or whether you don't know enough to rate. And then we're going to look at the feasibility. So the first poll, Rosita, if you could put it up now. Let me stop my sharing. And we'll give you a few minutes to rate each of the 10, giving one answer for each one, but only one. Rosita, and the one that came up on my screen, I'm not able to vote. Okay, I see it now.
How do I scroll down to the next?
The gray bar that's on the right side of your screen, move it down with your cursor.
Wait a minute, that's what thanks.
We're doing way better than the New York City primaries. We already have 80% of the voters responding, but we'll give you a couple more minutes.
And then will the next poll be the feasibility?
Correct, on
Okay.
these same 10 items.
Right.
And once we finish with the polls, we'll turn to the chat. And those of you who have finished the poll could be starting to put questions for any of the panelists in the chat. And we're going to end it in 1 minute. Okay, we are going to close the poll. And Rosita, we're going to share the results later. And now can you put up the second poll? And the second poll is asking you to rate them on the feasibility of change. We're saying by 2024, in the next 4 years, for the purpose of reducing food insecurity and hunger. And once again, high feasibility, medium feasibility, or low feasibility, or you don't know enough to rate. And we'll again give you a few minutes. We're now at 70% participation. We'll go for another 90 seconds or so, and then switch to your questions. If you have them, please put them in the chat.
I predict an inverse relationship between feasibility and importance.
We'll see. We're going to close it in 20 seconds. Okay. Thank you all for your participation. And Rosita, can we look at the results of the first one?
Yes, sharing them right now.
Thank you. So we can see that there are a few like online enrollment, alternative programs for immigrants, SNAP enrollment for college students, increases in the minimum benefit that seem of high importance. There are more of high importance on this list than lower. And like any good advocate, what we're looking for are ones that are both high importance and high feasibility of change. We'll see if we have such items. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll present a more detailed analysis and post it on our website and in our newsletter to be able to inform the agendas of all of us working for improving SNAP. Rosita, do you now want to share the feasibility one?
Yes, just a second. There it is.
And my first look is that there are less consensus about high feasibility. A lot of them have sort of 50% or so. And some of the important ones, like number 4, although you all thought it was very important, you don't think it's so feasible. And that isn't a stopping point. The question then becomes, so what do you do to change the political environment, to build the social movements that Jan talked about, to make it more feasible, to change the prospects. And we've all seen examples where changing the public opinion led to changes in policy. I do see on college students that there's both relatively high feasibility and relatively high importance. So that might be an area where we're already seeing changes. At the Food Policy Institute, we're leading a SNAP enrollment at CUNY right now and hoping to see some significant increases. I'd now, if you can close that now, Rosita. And we now turn to the chat, and we would be happy to consider some of your questions. And maybe to stimulate the discussion and also to interpret the quick view we had of the poll, I can ask each of the panelists to talk for just a minute or so about the one policy change you would recommend as the priority for the next period, both to incorporate the lessons from the pandemic and to address the problems that we're still facing from the pandemic. So one main change. Samir, might you get started on that with us? Can someone unmute Samir? Let me see if I can. There
Okay.
we go.
I'm unmuted now. So my personal opinion would be to perhaps simply extend the more relaxed rules forced by the pandemic. It turns out making it easier to use SNAP makes it easier to use SNAP. And I think the pandemic has demonstrated SNAP agencies are capable. The federal government has been capable, and most importantly, beneficiaries have gained from the program being easier to sign up for, being easier to use, being easier to kind of recertify. And so that would be my suggestion. And I did want to share the Biden administration issued an executive order yesterday on transforming federal customer experience and service delivery. And part of that, it includes the Secretary of Agriculture shall identify opportunities to reduce burdens by simplifying enrollment and recertification for nutrition assistance programs like SNAP. And so I think that's exactly the kind of thing that I think USDA could and should prioritize. And it just makes tremendous sense given what we've learned from the pandemic.
Great, thanks. Jan, you want to give us your 1 minute?
Yeah, I think we need to shift the calendar for recalculating the benefits based on the Thrifty food plan from once a year to every 6 months. I would propose actually to do it quarterly if we're going to have food price inflation like we've been having recently. But I'd be interested to hear from my colleagues on the panel whether that would create too much of an administrative challenge or burden. But once every 6 months, I think is definitely feasible. So that's the quick and dirty answer.
Great. And Sergio, your top recommendation?
Yeah, I think I echo what my colleagues have said, and but one of the things is these groups that have been excluded, just removing those either the lifetime ban on formerly incarcerated individuals or on people who are here illegally, being able to access this critical program to ending hunger would be one of the things that we have to address, and eliminating obviously work requirements as well to be able to access the program.
Great, thank you. We have some questions coming in. Abigail, thank you for your question. She asked to address the income cliff drop. Could the benefits be slowly decreased as a percentage of income in a manner that would not lead beneficiaries to a net loss? Any thoughts on that from any of the panelists?
So I would just add, I'm curious to hear from others, that SNAP does have a gradual phase out, but that's only if you are under that 130% cutoff. And so I think that's a good feature that SNAP has, and it's not true for every public benefit program. And so, yeah, I think that's a great idea. But I think it's those income limits that outright remove people that are the problem. And to address that, I think to your point, it would make a lot more sense for them to be kind of gradual phase out. And we're seeing some states experimenting with that for other public benefit programs. I haven't seen that for SNAP, but I think that makes a lot of sense.
Great, thanks. Anything to add, Jan or Sergio?
No, we should do it.
Next question, Jennifer, thank you for your question. She asks, are there any suggestions for best practices for conducting research on SNAP, reflecting the real lived experience of the people most affected?
Well, I think of Maggie Dickinson's article on the experience of college students and college administrators trying to facilitate SNAP enrollment as an example of learning from the lived experience and then translating it into policy recommendations. Maybe you can put Maggie's I think it's Ag and Human Values, but put that article in the resource list if it's not already there. Because I think sometimes the policy implications are obvious to researchers who are deeply engaged, but they need to be specified. So that would be my example. And I think the more we hear from one of the changes in SNAP over the 50 years is that it reaches a threshold of participation where everybody knows someone who participates in the program, or nearly everyone. Remember when President Bush Sr. had never seen a barcode in the grocery store? I mean, nearly everyone knows someone personally who participates in SNAP. And this creates a different potential for advocacy. But that's an aside.
Thanks. The next question is from Yemi. Thank you for your question. How important is the role of private technology applications like providers, formerly Fresh EBT, in making enrollment, accessing, and tracking SNAP benefits compared to how the government addresses these issues? And maybe one of you would want to talk more broadly about the use of technology to facilitate or impede SNAP administration. And Nevin, if you're on and have more to say about this afterwards, welcome your comments too. Any of you want to talk about technology?
Well, I mean, just the possibility when the HRA, when Stephen Banks became the director of HRA undertook a big initiative to increase the accessibility of the application and recertification process online. And it's made a big difference for low-income households that have access to technology. So, I mean, that's an example that you could document the increase in the percentage of those eligible who succeed in making their way through the application process. They also engaged in an effective partnership with emergency food providers, with food pantries especially, to assist people in applications. And this is what we're asking colleges to do now, is to actually assist students in submitting the documents you need to apply for SNAP online. So, you know, online application and recertification has opened a big direction. It's partly the technology that makes me say it's time to go back to changing the value of the Thrifty food plan every 6 months, because clearly that's well within our technological capacity.
We have another political question that maybe each of you would have something to say about. What would be, this is a question from Carla, what would be the benefits or limitations of separating SNAP from the Farm Bill?
Well, I'll start. The history suggests that this would not be desirable. This is an ongoing discourse in the broader SNAP community. But there have been a number of points in the history of SNAP where the fact that it was the Agriculture Committee that was responsible for forming the legislation has protected it from particularly from the contract with America. Remember the contract with America, the conservative Newt Gingrich-led assault on public benefits for low-income people. So my reading in the history tells me that the association with agriculture is protective. And, you know, just to make clear in case it's not obvious, if the agriculture committee has a vested interest, or the agriculture committees, but especially the Senate, in keeping SNAP under agricultural jurisdiction and keeping it a large, expansive program, because that's most of the money they control. So it's most of the stuff they can bargain with to protect their other agenda, the support of basic commodities and other shenanigans that some of us would like to see them end. So I vote for keeping it in agriculture, but I'm well aware that that's not the only reasonable opinion out there.
Samir or Sergio, do you have questions on that?
Yeah, I can offer. Sorry,
a little bit.
Sergio, go ahead.
Sergio, start,
Yeah.
and then Samir.
Okay. You know, I think one of the benefits, I'll talk about to the benefit and a little bit of the downside, but one of the benefits is that this forces, you know, being inside the Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill being a massive piece of legislation that a lot of people have interest in, means that it usually comes up every 5 years. It's reauthorized. You know, if it was to be taken out, I don't know if we would, and it tends to be really bipartisan. Things are shifting now. We'll see in this new authorization how bipartisan it is, but I think it plays a critical role in it, and it can continue to be in there. One of the downside is you do need to compromise. We don't always get what we want in there just because it's one of the, you know. So that's my opinion.
Thanks. Samir?
Yeah, I just wanted to flag Adam Scheingate, a researcher at Johns Hopkins, has done some work looking at the evolution of the Farm Bill coalition. And it seems that although it has become more partisan based on that work, it still seems protective to include SNAP in the Farm Bill. And indeed, Republicans from districts with larger farm populations are less likely to support SNAP cuts, at least in the 2018 Farm Bill. And so I think it makes sense to keep it there, but I also think it makes sense to think about how the coalition that supports the Farm Bill has changed, and what the increasingly important role of private food industry is in that coalition.
Who did you say the name of the researcher at Johns Hopkins?
Yeah, Adam Scheingate.
Thanks. Okay.
One of my mentors when I was there, but yeah.
So we have another question. Can you talk about the benefit that programs such as Get the Good Stuff and Healthbox, both New York City programs, have had, and the possibility of expansion? And maybe to broaden that question a little, what are your thoughts about connecting SNAP to other municipal, state, and federal food programs in a more integrated way, to school food and so on? Any thoughts from any of you on that?
Well, you had asked me about that in an earlier conversation. And I have to say that I don't think the big issue is coordination. The school food programs, I think, should be regarded as part of education, and that we should move to universal provision so that we're focused on what kind of nutrition and food education are we offering to our students, all students across the board, so that I believe school food should stop being a welfare program. But I also think it's very important to recognize that school food is the one area where we feed, there is no exclusion of children because they're immigrants, because they're not documented, because all kids in school have access to school meals. And in New York City, all kids have access to the meals free of charge. So I think there's no way to take SNAP benefits out of the means-tested welfare realm, but I think we can do that with child nutrition benefits. So I'd be careful about that. I do also want to point out that in the pandemic EBT essentially provided a SNAP-like supplement to households with children in school. So there was a coordination there under the difficult circumstances of the pandemic.
Samir or Sergio, thoughts on that? So I wanted to just say a few words about Healthbox, which is a New York City program to provide enhanced benefits for SNAP recipients and others to buy fruits and vegetables at farmers stand. And I'm an enthusiast about that program, but I think it's been funded at a level where it is a tiny fraction of the food budget of both people with SNAP, and it's a state and city-funded program, primarily a New York City-funded program, but it has not been funded at the level where it could have a population health impact. And I think Healthbox is the kind of program of creating incentives for people to buy healthier food, using it to support local and regional farms and locally and regionally grown food. I think there's a lot of potential there, and I would love to see significant expansion, significant increases in federal, state, and city funding for Healthbox. And I think Healthbox is also the kind of program that Sergio was talking about before that could be extended to populations who aren't eligible for the full range of SNAP benefits, since it is a city program. We have a deep question from Catherine that I wanted to put out for you. She writes that she's very concerned about the threat of food prices continuing to go up due to the changing climate and water shortages in areas where food is grown. And she says USDA acknowledges in their recent report on climate change in agriculture. Any suggestions on how to advocate with congressional representatives about the threat of more need for benefits for more people in the future and for the next farm bill?
Yeah, it's a concern hugely of ours going into this next farm bill. And one of the things that we're trying to raise is, when we're looking at it, we got to look at the whole food systems and the role that climate change is playing into it. And it's one of the top priorities of ours. You know, we were hoping that there was going to be some more free money freed up in the farm bill, because we expected to Build Back Better to be a larger piece of legislation that would have freed up some funding there for some other initiatives. So we got to wait. We're waiting to Build Back Better to be done to see if there's going to be any extra funding. But this is one of the areas that we remain really concerned in. We're trying to spend a lot of time speaking with legislators and offices about these growing concerns, especially those members that represent areas that would be highly affected by this, especially small farmers. And
Great. Samir, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, this is a topic that I think is really important. There's been some effort to encourage the USDA and HHS to include sustainability considerations in the National Dietary Guidance. And there's been some resistance to that, but I think doing that could be a step to kind of formally acknowledge the importance of thinking about sustainability effects and kind of the realities of what foods are available, given kind of climate change and related issues. And so I think that's one potential angle to pursue that important goal.
Great. April has a question. Is there any research around SNAP participants' household budgets still falling short? Any discussion of providing financial literacy and increasing know-how of maximizing SNAP benefits among participants to build patterns of self-sufficiency? Any thoughts on April's question?
SNAP Ed tries to work on those issues in many states. So I think it's there. But you know, the common discussion of this is that the SNAP benefits run out at the end of the second week or sometime in the third week of the month. The recalculation of the Thrifty food plan will help because of the benefit will increase, but it's being overtaken by the rapid rise in food prices. So that if we're not careful, we will be back to square one. I mean, SNAP benefits are calculated on the assumption that families can allocate 30% of their disposable income to the purchase of food, and that SNAP is going to fund the difference between that and the cost of the Thrifty food plan. But as energy prices rise, that affects the ability of families to make that allocation. Rents and shelter costs, even though there is an excess shelter cost deduction from the calculation of benefits. Anyway, we need to pay attention. This is what I mean about people on the ground paying attention to the realities that families are experiencing and translating it into policy. Families can be helped to manage better, but when there's not enough money to buy food, there's not enough money to buy food.
And there's a closing question from Nick, which is, there's long been a debate within the food movement about to what extent it's possible or appropriate to use SNAP to encourage, incentivize healthier food consumption and to reduce the ubiquity and promotion of unhealthy food. There's debate about what role the food industry ought to play, as I think you asked before, Samir. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts about how to have a productive policy discussion that isn't victim blaming, but that considers both health and food security. In thinking about how to use SNAP to promote the health of the American people, as well as to reduce food insecurity. Any thoughts on that? And then we're going to end.
Yeah, I would say this is a really, I think, important challenge, particularly for the nutrition advocacy community. It seems like there are easier kind of paths that we can pursue. And so I'll just highlight two of them. The one being incentivizing what we can all agree is healthy fruit and vegetable purchasing. And so not taking away or restricting benefits per se, but making it easier through additional discounts for fruits and vegetables, for example, at the supermarket. And there's been some innovative work to kind of do what's being done at farmers markets in supermarkets for fruits and vegetable incentives. And so I think that's one pathway to do it without getting into the trickier questions. And then also, if we're relying on retailers, if retailers are relying on SNAP dollars to fund their business, should we have a say in how they market unhealthy food? And I think that, to me, makes sense. And again, is a place we can put some pressure without telling individuals what they can or can't buy. And so I think maybe those two pathways seem to me as more practical.
I have always, along with most of the people I know, opposed the idea of food taxes. But after our seminars on hyper-processed foods, I'm ready to make an exception and say that we really, given the health consequences of reliance on hyper-processed foods and sugar-sweetened beverages, we ought to consider a tax, a sin tax type tax on those foods to make them less affordable and less attractive. I don't think it should be specific to SNAP participants. It ought to apply to us all.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would add is I think we need to address some of the food deserts, or address people having the access to that high quality nutritious food. You know, a lot of rural communities or urban areas, you know, just don't have access to those things because they live in a food deserts, and being able to, I think there could be some congressional legislation that could be done to address some of that.
Sergio, can I ask you a quick question? I got an email this morning that this is an action day in the Food Research and Action Center Action Network, urging people to call their senators to pass the Build Back Better Act with the nutrition provisions intact. And I wondered if Bread for the World is also promoting this kind of agenda.
Yes. So yeah, so there's $10 billion inside of Build Back Better to address child nutrition. So it would expand community eligibility, which you were referring to earlier. So increasing the number of schools that could offer free and reduced lunch. It would also take, as you know, pandemic EBT, fund summer EBT, well, which is now summer EBT. It would fund it for the next 3 to 4 years as well. And then it has some money in there for school kitchens and some other research programs as well. But those are the two main components in the nutrition side of things.
Okay, so there's a phone number. I'll put it in the chat if that's okay.
Great, thank you. And that's maybe a good note to end on, that the questions about where we go with SNAP are in front of us today. They're in front of Congress and the president. They're in front of the state agencies that administer it, and they're in front of cities. And together, we need to set our priorities on how we want to shape SNAP for the next period while the pandemic is still having its devastating effect and beyond that. And I hope our session today helped to inform us all about how to develop that shared agenda. And I want to so much thank our panelists, Samir, Jan, and Sergio, for their contributions, and to thank all of you for your participation and your questions. And we wish you the best for the holidays, and we look forward to seeing you at our forums in 2022. Happy New Year to all of you.
When can we see the poll results side by side, or?
We'll put them up on the website in the next couple of days with some interpretation.
Great. Okay. Thanks.